Good morning, everyone. This is Coach Wildman, and it's another Coach the Coaches Saturday morning. Today, we're extremely fortunate to have two heavy hitters with us. Our co-host is Trinity Western University women's head coach Ryan Hofer, and our other special guest is NCAA multiple championship coach Jim McLaughlin. So thanks for being with us, Jim.
David, I appreciate it. Coach Hofer, always a pleasure.
As most people know, feel free to put your questions and comments and stuff in the comment box, and we'll try to get through those. But we're gonna be on here for an hour and pick your mind. But the very first question I kind of wanted to start off with is that I think, and Ryan and I were debating this, is I think you're the only coach to win a national NCAA championship on the men's side as well as on the women's side. Is that correct?
I don't know. I know we did that, and I had a lot of help in doing it, but I was never a big guy looking into the record books. I don't know.
Sure, but I mean, now let's talk. Obviously the games are extremely different and similar in their own ways. Can you tell us about your journey on how you transitioned into be able to change and still have that great result on the female side of things?
Well, David, coaching to me is coaching, and I don't think it's gender specific. I always have believed women can do what men do. I think, the eye work is the same, the movements are the same, and there are subtle variations. There are differences in the men's and the women's game, but I've taught it the same way. Maybe I talk to women a little different than I talk to men, because you have to understand the people you're coaching. But women can work hard, they can compete hard, they can lead, they can do all the things that you have to do to be successful. So, coaching to me was coaching.
No. Fair. Ryan's going to start us off with some questions, and then I'm going to kind of mediate the comment section. So, Ryan, I'll throw it over to you.
Hey, Jim, you had a pretty nice tenure at UW, and that's where I got a chance to know you pretty good. I was always impressed with your practice organization. It was just a smooth-running machine. People were learning, growing. There was a good intensity and vibe in that. Could you just unpack a little bit of some of your practice principles, the things that you want to have in place when you want to start a good practice and make sure that that's consistent over time?
Sure. For me, I got into my routines, and the routines were a little bit different by team, but I had a process that I followed, and we knew each team where they were at, where we wanted to go, and then we had to identify their greatest needs, 3 or 4 of those needs, and we'd call those our big rocks, and we'd write those things down. And then we also had our little rocks, where I believe when you develop a team, you develop the team through the individual development, and there's a lot of things that go into that, but so we identified each player and what their needs were and started to develop a role and do those things. But I had a big rock list, a little rock list, and then I had the things that maybe a grid for the week of all the things that we felt were really important, and we would prioritize those things. And then it went into actually scripting and sequencing some activities. And the most important thing for me was that these activities had this great amount of transfer to the game, because as traditionally coaches will do some activities that have minimal transfer, and so that was important to me. And then maybe the most important thing was at the end of each practice, we just take 3 minutes and ask the question, how can we do that better? I asked that of myself, and I looked at it every which way, and most of the time that comes down to seeing things maybe a little manipulation in the drill, but given better feedback, repeating things. And so I don't think there was any magic, but it took me about 2 hours to prepare a 2.5 hour practice, for sure.
Can you give us an example of some of the things that might be on your big rock list and some of the things that might be on your little rock list?
Sure. There are some things that don't come off. Serve and pass is so critical. And it correlates to your ability to play the game at the highest level, at all levels. And so I don't think that ever came off my list. It didn't. It was really important to me, and we would start practice with it and end practice with it, just primacy, recency stuff. So the kids knew it was important and they would retain it better and recall it better. Yeah, and then there was, I think, hitter toolbox, hitters that can give direction to the ball and hit with range and make the right choice in the specific situation. I studied that all the time. And over the years, that became more and more important, that we had this toolbox in place for all hitters and made it, opponents have to respond to a number of good attackers. And it made it tough on them. And then, our defensive package, that was really important to me too. The action-reaction format of getting people and understanding their responsibilities and how to react quickly to a situation, which is all about some eye work. And so we spent a lot of time on our defensive creating opportunities and then learning how to convert those opportunities, and that was really important. And then there were these other things, that subtle variations that would come and go, and that we would, based on what the team needed, and then you get into some specifics. But those things were generally on my Big Rock list every year I coached.
I wanted to have you maybe unpack a little bit more. In the Pac-10 or 12 where you were at, it's pretty hard to score points and to be successful. Could you unpack a little bit of how are the things, or what are the things that you did with your hitter's toolbox in order to score points in that league, in order to be one of the perennial contenders in that league and competing for a national championship?
That's a great question. I was thinking about that all the time, Ryan. How can we get better at this? How can we do it better than it's ever been done before? I asked our kids every day, do something better than you did yesterday. And they would have to become mindful. They'd have to think the right thoughts. It was a big deal in practice. And practice could influence our growth, for sure. But it's the same old question that we are stuck with. How much variability do we write into our practices? We want a lot of transfer, and we hear this all the time, and it's critical. The game teaches the game, and we're going to go out and we're going to go live bullets, and there's going to be all this variability. So we got to play a lot. But when you're playing a lot, that's a good thing. But also, the bigger the game, the fewer the reps. So could we maximize our growth and maybe create a situation in smaller groups where it was less aggressive, and we could have the players in the same position on the court, reacting with the same speed, but stabilize the feedback, and you'd see immediate growth in the different situations that they were going to have to respond to, and then plug that into the bigger game with an emphasis. So, before Carl passed away, he said to me, take this thing to another level. And I think that's a huge deal. So I would work in our laboratory and find ways to help these players solve these problems, and work with them. And then I would talk to Carl about it, and he would say, "Ooh, I like that," or I tweak this, and we felt like we got pretty good, and it was good for the players, and they got a return, so it was all right.
Got a question here from Jared Mathis. Carl McGowan was known for saying, "Do your own damn study." What are some studies you initiated that you found the most insightful?
Wow, God, good question, David. Carl said that, and he was right. I did a study last week, and a coach called me and asked me some questions. So instead of me just giving this theory, I wanted to get into some application, and so I did a study to show. And it was just it was a pass and set study, all the different things that can happen to take care of the ball, but then the setter seeing this serve and then paying attention to this, the passer passing the ball and getting a jump so she can create her rhythm and her balance as she starts to make her movements to the ball. So I think these little rhythm movements are as important as these movements we're teaching. And so I was telling this coach, they asked me about, passing and implicit, methods of teaching where we're going to define everything and have great structure, to the implicit where we're going to create a drill that kind of will work towards the behavior we want without giving much feedback. And I was telling her we got to have a little bit of both, and ultimately we got to but the players are starting to solve these problems a little bit and we're helping them. But there's also a problem with that, because as I'm presenting this study, showing her these little details, I'm showing her that we can help accelerate what they're doing and how they're solving these problems. And so I did that, and I wrote out every play and I told them what I saw, and then we had to identify, what are we going to do with this info? We've got to write some activities, and we've got to teach it the right way, and get a return on it, and then see these behaviors starting to happen. So it's a big time stuff, and it's important. It's wonderful. And then I did an outside hitter study for a coach, just talking about why are these hitters in such perfect rhythm, and they're balanced and they address the ball, and it looks like they were born that way, but we know they weren't. We know they had to learn these things, just like Ryan talked about. How do we teach this stuff to them? And so I was showing them the basic fundamental approach. Now there's variation, but there's a difference between variation and idiosyncrasies. If you have too many idiosyncrasies, it's going to screw up your team, and it almost contributes to unforced errors. But so I studied all this stuff, and I would show them specifically so they could see it. And when they see it, then they're going, oh, now I got it. I understand why. So maybe I'm doing those studies every day, But David, the one thing I got to tell you about McGowan that was so special was, and Brian knows, he would send me these studies that you're talking about, and studies from these scientists in these different laboratories, and I would read them and say, Carl, we know this stuff. You told me this stuff 10 years ago. And he just said, yes, I'm just happy, and I'm glad that they're defending it. They're supporting what we have believed for a while, and they're putting names on it. Example, constraints-led approach, CLA. A coach called me about that, and I said, well, we were doing that, having hitters only hit high line, serve in a certain area, only making a specific move when a ball addresses you a certain way, and putting constraints on that. And now that's the latest research in the last 6 to 8 years. But Carl, and he exposed us, or people like Ryan Hofer and myself, to, this other way of being a coach. And instead of just being intuitive, and so it had a lasting impact, and I'm still doing those doggone studies.
Jim, tell us a little bit about managing a coaching staff. How do you divide up the roles and the responsibilities? Is there someone that takes offense, defense, middles, outside? What did you like to do with your coaching staff?
Well, I think, I'm going around helping coaches. And I see some things going on. One of them is their staffs can be a lot more efficient. And they think they're efficient, but they're not as efficient as they could be. I see a lot of coaching going on, and it's wonderful, but very little teaching. Not as much teaching as they think. And then I see and I hear these coaches, and there's tremendous knowledge, but we don't know how to apply that knowledge. And it's like, I'm getting away from your question a little bit. You give a lecture. We're not giving lectures. We are teaching motor learning principles. We're teaching neurological programs so they can respond to situations. And so we can't just tell them things. We want to get them into where they're just reacting, and the subconscious, we react much faster, maybe 500,000 times faster than the conscious, and so it's different. So back to your question. What was your question again?
Well, you brought up another question. What is the difference between teaching and coaching, or teaching and telling? I'd love you to unpack that, and then we'll get back to the assistant coaching.
Well, that's well, but we've talked about all this, Ryan.
I need to hear
coaching,
it. I need to hear it.
Coaching is a lot of stuff, and but when you talk about teaching, which I think is the most important part, you have to know a little bit about teaching. You don't have to know the whole thing and be a PhD. And when I started getting into motor learning principles and exercise physiology and biomechanics, Carl would shut me down and go, "You know enough about that. Just let it help you become a better teacher. Be a better teacher, Jim, or do you want to give lectures as a PhD?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Be the best coach, but understand teaching." The longer I was in coaching, there was a point where I came to the conclusion that it wasn't about concepts or novel ideas or systems or tactics or strategy or whatever. It was about the way you practice. And it was finding ways to practice things that you wanted your players to become proficient in how they move and how they strike the ball and they pass, and efficient in how they are going about it. And so in repeating the things that you want them to do on game day, because you want that repetition. So teaching and player development is huge. But I hear all the time, we're learning. My question is, what are we learning? Are we learning how to compete? Are we learning how to move? Are we learning how to see? Are we learning how to think? Are we learning how to control our emotions? Because we got to learn that. So I always just said, here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to do it. And here's why it's better than this other way. And so the issue again is transfer. How much transfer, and then how you sequence this transfer. And we got to help accelerate the process of how these players are solving this problem by asking lots of questions, by understanding what's going on in their mind, by teaching them the mental side of the game, which is more important than anything. How they approach and compete and do all those things. So I don't know. I think the environment, the conditions for learning are critical. And if you study success at a high level, you see that it's about these conditions. It's not genetics, it's not all this other, it's conditions, and that's how you think, it's how you behave, it's what's important to you, what you value, it's your emotions, it's your scripting of sequences, it's mentorship, it's teaching, it's all those things. So, I don't know, I think when I went into my office, I always asked the question every day for 30 years, how do I get my kids to understand the demands of the task? What opportunities do I give them to respond to? That's a critical question. It took me hours to figure that out. And then how do I give them the most meaningful feedback? And then I'd go into my office and I would ask myself first, am I teaching effectively, efficiently? Am I presenting and reinforcing these fundamentals that are so important? Am I going over the basic offensive and defensive principles? Am I motivating the right way? Am I explaining why we're doing things? So, and then it's an acquired skill. You have to develop, you have to learn how to teach. And the best way is to be around people that are good teachers and to understand some of the laws of learning. So that's a heck of a long answer.
Could you dive into a little bit about teaching the mental side of the game? I remember being with you once and I said, hey, do you do these team building stuff? Which I don't do that team building or those team building things, but I'm sure you do some sort of exercises or group things with your teams. How do you train culture, team building, mental training to put them in a position where they can handle a lot of tough stuff?
I think that's the most important thing, but those are two different things. Developing your culture is part of it. Your mental aspects of development are the most important thing, and developing the mind is part of everything you do. It's part of your learning, your culture, everything you're going to do, and it's important. And you don't need extra time, Ryan. That's you don't need these voodoo sessions where you need to. The best meetings for me were when we were in practice solving problems together and talking to each other, working in practice. Some of these other meetings can be toxic and blow up a team. And so you got to be careful about what you're talking about and those things, and especially the mental side of it, because we all have our own individual narratives. We all see things differently. And so as we develop the relationships with these kids and these players, we start to understand how we can help them, what their needs are, to get them to think the right thoughts. Because in human nature, 90% of, we think 60,000 thoughts a day, the average person, and 90% of them are negative. That's just, and you can't train like that. You can't live like that. You can't become a champion like that. So I think it's really important. You got to develop your mind, and it's just like you're developing your passing technique so when you're on the floor, you go out there after your preparation and your lifting and all your reps, and what do you have to rely on is your mind. That's it. So you can compete. So just think about this. Volleyball is gnarly because we stand around a lot. And when you're standing around, your brain is working. And generally, when you're in motion, you're not thinking. So you learn pretty quick if those thoughts you're thinking are helping you, or they can be devastating against the next play. And we can learn how to do those things and how to think the right thoughts at the right time. I think that's as important as setting your platform at the right time and getting the right angle. So a little bit like learning to focus, how to really have a good focus, and that turns into ability to concentrate. And when you concentrate, you see little tiny details, and I would ask players about that to keep them on task. And so you got to get into the right mental zone or mental state, and that's about player maturity, emotional maturity. Some players are emotional and they can get too emotional and make errors because of that. And so as they become more confident and they're working on these mental skills and they mature, they begin to understand exactly how the emotional state they need to be in to perform well. And you got to learn how to get to that zone or that state so you can compete at the highest level and be a good competitor. And so, I don't know, I'm giving you too much stuff.
No, you're not giving us too much stuff. I got a question here from Rhonda. She's the Olds College women's coach up here in Alberta. How do you help athletes move from operating from the conscious to subconscious movement?
Well, I mean, if you understand learning, you know we are going to be in this cognitive phase at some point, and it's not fun. It sucks. So, you know, you're thinking hard, and you're in it until you get out of it, and then you go into this associative phase where you're starting to process things are becoming more a part of you. And then if you keep learning, you got a coach that's directing you right and helps you and knows where you're at, works with you. Then you get into the autonomous phase, and you're not really thinking. You're automatic, you're moving, you're doing those things. But, you know, I think it's, when you talk about player development, there's a balance between the two. There's a balance between the emotional and the physical. And it's really, really important. And so, and that balance is critical to winning. And so for me, those two ideas go hand in hand. It's very basic. When you learn how to play well and react well, you're going to get more wins for sure. And so, again, the key is the maturity. But we can start working with kids at 12 years old on these things. And these are their thoughts. You know, kids all have issues, we all do, but they're not the coach's issues, and they got to let the coach help them solve these issues. And so, and then there's no magic. Forget what coach's name was, but you're going to get there if you're trained right, you're in the right activities, the coach is giving good feedback. Yeah, you're going to get there where it becomes part of you and you can react.
Awesome. Ryan?
I'm going to go back to the question I had earlier that we got sidetracked on. How do you manage your coaches? Meaning, how do you divvy up responsibilities in your gym? So everybody comes down to the floor and Susie's doing this and Craig's doing, or whatever. Like, how do you divvy that up?
Well, you know about your coaches. I remember Marv Dunphy telling me it's the only profession where you get to choose who you want to be with and who you're going to go through this with. And it's so doggone hard coaching that you better go through it with people that you're with. But the first thing I saw was inefficiency in a staff. Well, we've got to define the roles just like a team. You know, a staff has different core values than the team when we start getting into it. But when you define things, then you can start to grow together and you can start to become efficient. Now, people get better at what they do and they can expand their abilities like a player, and they should. And then that job description may change a little bit. But the deal is the alignment of the staff. You know, you have to be aligned, and there's got to be a vision by the head coach that people are aligned with and agree with. We can have disagreements and other things, but if you're not aligned, you're going to have some severe problems. And so, you know, you're going to have problems anyway when you're working with people, but you can solve those problems if you're aligned. And that's what we do. You know, regardless of what's ahead of us, we're going to talk about some things that we're not going to worry about the circumstances. We're going to do what we have to do to be a champion, because there are certain things you have to do to be a champion. And you can't say, well, the circumstances don't prevent me from doing it. Baloney. If we're going to be a champion, here's what we got to do. And you do that in your collective in a staff. This is a group effort. And I always wanted people that complimented me and knew my strengths and weaknesses. And then we grew together. And I learned that from McLaughlin, because he told me, Jim, you're on your own. When I first got to Washington, you got to develop your staff. Well, I did. But what I did was, when I went into practice, I gave everything I had to those players. We divided up our eyes, but maybe I tell one of my assistants, just make sure they're 10 by 10. Just make sure they're taking a jab step and they're using their hands and they're jabbing at the right time. And that's it. And then we'd go watch the film and we'd talk about a process of getting those things in place if the behavior wasn't changing. And so, but I never coached them in practice. I coached, I was focused, I wanted to see the thing, and I didn't coach my coaches. But in the office, I'd spent an hour with the defensive side and an hour with the offensive side, and we got on the same page. And then it came where they were pointing things out to me, because 4 eyes are better than 2 eyes, 6 eyes are better than 4 eyes. And we could see more things and develop our coaching eye, and then we could solve it together. But alignment to me was the deal.
So a question for you, Jim, is I know this coach, he coaches at Trinity Western, the women's team, and he's really big into culture and having the same culture and how he recruits athletes for his team. How did you deal with recruiting? We had Russ Rose on here a few weeks ago, and it was it was very interesting, his comments regarding recruitment through all the NCAA. Are you like Russ Rose? You're a straight shooter. Tell it how it is. This is how it's going to be, and that's the expectation. Or what sort of things do you look for when you were recruiting athletes?
Yeah, I always, I wanted to be like Russ, and I admired that about him more than anything. As he shot straight, he shoots straight, and he doesn't worry about what people think. He's going to tell the truth, and the truth, people can handle it. They might not like it, but they can handle it. It's when coaches start throwing curveballs and saying different things, and they play mind games. That doesn't fly, So, yeah, my daughter could play for Russ for sure. But in recruiting, to me, I don't know if I was as good as Russ. For sure, probably not. But I think we were good at identifying the kids we wanted, kids that wanted to be coached, kids that had met the threshold physically, kids that wanted to be part of doing something incredibly tough, but would get the return on it. And then, so we recruited, and I always I painted the picture of how brutal it was going to be. I was bad at the dog and pony show, but that goes on a lot, and maybe I should have been better at it. But and then it goes into player development. You got to recruit, but you also have to have player development. The situation is, I didn't want to have a kid come in who was a top player and not get better through, because that's the measure of a coach. Whether you get them and they're really good or they need to learn skills, are we developing their abilities, expanding their abilities all the way to the national team and beyond? Because I still think you're learning. And so player development was really important. Those were the two aspects, but I wasn't going to sell my soul to recruit a kid, and I wasn't going to lie to him, and I wasn't going to miss practice and fly during the week to go see a kid, because these other kids committed to playing for me. Now, I was on the plane every weekend, and I would be in the gym till 11:30 at night, and Andy Banikowski would be falling asleep next to me, and we'd be the only two in there. I'll do that. But I wanted to be in the gym teaching volleyball, and so maybe I wasn't a good recruiter.
So was that something that you managed with your staff? Was it your assistant coaching, or did you have a specific one person that was the recruiter, if you will, that took all these trips to find potential prospects?
Well, when they NCAA switched where we didn't have the baton rule and we could send out 3 coaches, I thought, great, we're going to give some rest to one of the coaches.
Right.
Because we would try to sweep the country, and of course we'd hit the hot spots, but then it became, I spent $60,000 more in recruiting because everybody was out every weekend.
Right.
But it's back to Ryan's question on finding a staff. I thought I had this brilliant idea, and you guys know how it is. We all have our ideas, our intuitions, but we must test everything we do to see if they're any good. And I had Tui and my other assistant as the co-coordinators for recruiting, and they would run the recruiting meeting and all that, and they would basically tell me what to do. But then Tui came into my office one day and said, just give it to me. Let me do it, which is, when your assistants are going above and beyond what their description is, and they're finding ways to make us better. And Tui was awesome. I mean, in so many ways. But she kind of said, let me do it. And our recruiting it took off because of her. And so Yeah, but I think it all goes in, that stuff starts going into the culture of your staff.
Mm-hmm.
If your culture with your staff isn't good, how does that example get the team culture, the vibe right? Because if you don't get that right, you're not going to win. You can't. You have to get a culture in place. And I think that's, I don't know, it's more important than people think. It's more important than anything we did technically.
So how do you manage expectations? You know, you're one of the you are one of the top programs in the country. You're picking from the best athletes in the club levels. These athletes are going from potentially, you know, obviously never coming off the court to potentially sitting on the bench for, you know, their whole first year, you know, based on the situation, of course. How do you manage that shift in mindset for athletes to realize that they're there for the long run in the bigger picture?
Well, for sure, you know, we talked a lot about standards. I tended to talk more about standards and expectations, and I believe in my heart, you know, you hear people say all the time, David, you know, you get what you deserve, and there's truth to that, but you also get what you expect. Mm-hmm. And so it's expectations, you got to be careful with them, because you don't want to set a ceiling that's too low, and you don't want to make it so difficult that it's, you know, it causes more stress than already is there. So we valued standards over expectations a little bit, because expectations can be a little volatile, unreliable. So I would talk a lot to the staff about that, and I would talk about standards are really, I think Coach K said it better than anybody, it's how you live your life. So I wanted to do everything at the high end with great effort, great focus, great energy, all those things. And that was really important to me. And do the best we can. And when we make mistakes, learn from it. On the player side, what I would tell them is, are you pursuing excellence and holding yourself to higher standards, elevated standards? Are you doing that? I would ask them, are you setting the bar higher every day, or do you, come on, you know, can you get out of your comfort zone? Can you have these demands on yourself at the highest level? And they're going to learn that they can handle that stuff, and they're going to become more confident as they solve these problems and get places they've never been. So we also talked about life is about choices and commitment, you know, and so, yeah, I mean, it was known at Washington, if you come there, we got to get to the Final Four and have a chance to win it. But you know what? We talked about that. We didn't even need to talk about it because it was evident, and we talked about a process, and we dove into that deep and stayed process driven. You know, pushing limits was part of the process, and feeling safe in that environment, but not seeking safety, feeling safe that they wanted to push and come and ask for help and ask questions. Jim, what do I need to do? And then, David, you're getting me going here.
No, go. Keep going. Keep going.
You know, so I don't know. I just, we are humans, and we're fighting human nature. We get in our little comfort zones, and to kick butt at a high level and to win a championship, it's so doggone hard. And you got to have the right understanding of improvement. You got to have the right process. You got to have the right attitude. You got to be right in your mind, heart, and body. And so that's why coaching is so fun. It's just, there's a lot to it.
Have you ever been in a situation, this is an odd question, or a loaded question, sorry, Jim. You know, obviously us coaches, we're looking at a yearly training plan, and maybe, you know, it's a rebuild year for a potential team, and you're like, okay, this isn't going to be the year. I mean, everyone's expectation is obviously make Final Four, win the championship, and move forward. But have you, you know, how do you deal with the expectations if you know it's a rebuild year? Or was always the focus to be, like, were you realistic with athletes, and were athletes realistic in the process, rather than, okay, we're going to win the NCAA national championship this year? I mean, of course that's the goal in the grand scheme of things, but but if you don't, if it's let's say a lot of first and second years, maybe it's like going to Notre Dame, for example, like you jump into a new program and then you make your mark on it. How do you manage sort of that mental aspect with athletes on the process of here's the kind of the layout of how we're going to do things, if that makes sense?
It does, David. That's why I like your show so much. You're talking about good stuff, but I don't know where to start with it. I think it's I don't know. I forget the basic beginning of your question.
Well, like, are you straight with, are you, again, like kind of more like Russ Rose, are you straight going, this is kind of like, okay, this year we're not going to, our goal is to make, let's say, Final 16. And then because, next year we're going to be Final 4. And then the next year we're going to be the national championships. Yeah.
I don't think we control that stuff. I think we control improvement. And my job, and it goes back to Ryan, I wanted coaches around me that had an understanding of how we were going to teach, what we were going to teach, how we were going to teach, and why it was important, and dive into that process of improvement. And not worry about, I never did worry about expectation. I wanted to win the national championship every year, and I put my heart and my soul and everything I had into it. But really what I was doing every day was trying to just get a little bit better every day. The worst thing as a coach is to work your butt off and to go through a week of practice and you haven't made progress. And that's more painful than anything.
Right.
But I never worried about, this is a year. The only time I ever did that was when my AD came in and said, we'd like to get the Final Four in Seattle and tell us. And I just, it was the one time I went, well, if we have one more year of development, we're meeting higher standards, we could meet the standards of getting to the Final Four. Yeah, let's go in a year and not next year. And he said, okay, and so, but then again, it didn't change the process. Whether we got to the Final Four or not, we were just working so hard to get better. And so, but you're right. The thing, David, is the more excitement. People don't understand this. People think you get to the Final Four, life is, it's so much better. Well, that's not the case. With more excitement, more people involved, more people care about it, it just gets harder. But what makes it harder makes it better. And so when you have the pressure and the expectation to get to the gold medal match, those are good. That's what you want. You don't want this expectation, well, we just got to make the Olympics, or go to the Final Four. Let's get in and let's go in, but let's just understand we've got to get into a process that we can control and work as hard as we can, because the other guy's getting better too, and make as much progress as we can. And I love that part of coaching.
Awesome.
I like winning too. But, if we do the other thing, then we're going to have a better probability of winning.
Jim, tell us a little bit about how you managed family life and then the job of being a volleyball coach. Because I know you have 3 daughters, you have an amazing wife, and I know that they've been willing to move around the country for you a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about, did you have certain guidelines that you had, that certain principles, certain time off? How did you keep it all together?
Yeah, I think I got better at that, but I wasn't good for a while. This time off, I've been able to think deeply. I've learned a lot about the process of my coaching. I've learned about being a better husband. I learned about being a better dad, all those things. Our family time is unbelievable now, and I cherish it. And I think back, I missed a lot of stuff, but that's coaching. The demands are significant. Choices have a cost. Everything has a cost. Well, Margaret married me. She knew she was marrying a coach. I didn't know if she knew she was in for the ride we were on, but now she's going, hey, it's unconventional. But coaches call me all the time and ask me, how about balance, Jim? How do you, well, you know what? if you coach at a high level, then maybe you got to look at another job, because you got to do what you have to do to be as good as you have to be in coaching.
Mm-hmm.
It's just it's not any other profession. It's harder. And so, you can coach other levels, or you can coach where you can do a little 9 to 5, but this is not a 9 to 5 job. This is a brutal job, but, and I miss the thing, being in the gym, but could I have done it a little better? Sure. I had blind spots. I've learned about those things. I could do it a little better. I also am shocked that I did all the stuff, all the things you have to do every day as a coach and make all these decisions. I look back and go, how did I do it all? But I miss it. And I'm going, God, should I do it again? And, so I don't know. Family time is unreal. But when you get in to be excellent, it takes an effort that has to be excellent. And you can't make it coaching something that it isn't. And then the last thing, Ryan, is, one thing I tell young coaches, I'm around some coaches that work so hard, and you can get into a mode where you're so focused, you can do a little bit of isolating yourself. I would go in my office. I remember the tricks I think I learned from Marv. You don't put any chairs in your office because people come in and they can't sit down, so they're out of there, And, I got into that mode because I wanted to be good, and I wanted to set an example for my players that they knew this guy's working harder than anybody. Margaret, when I was home. I had to learn how to be present. I had to learn how to put the kids to bed. Well, usually I got home after they were in bed, but when I had time with them, I was there. And but I learned that the isolation, I needed a little outlet to recover. Just like an athlete goes hard, they need some recovery time. You can't have too much because you got things to do when you're in the season, but you got to invest at a level, and I see varying levels of commitment. And you're telling your kids you got to commit at the highest degree. Well, then you better do that as a coach. And I miss that a little bit too, because when you get into it, it's fun.
That was a great question, Ryan. Great answer, Jim. Question back from Rhonda from Olds College. What are your top 3 to 5 things you feel are important in order to be a championship team at the end of the season?
Oh, Rhonda. Well, continual improvement. Having a really well thought out plan, being able to be, adjust to that plan with all the stuff going on. You got to be able to adjust. And so that's a big deal. But I think the approach and the mindset is everything. I'm just into the mind. And I just wanted them thinking the right thoughts, thinking about things the right way. And so when they would come in, the first thing I wanted them to do, I used to tell all my players, improvement starts with I. Get into yourself and improve yourself. Overcome your weaknesses. We all have them. Don't hide your weaknesses. Don't show that, you got it perfect. None of us, we got to get better. That indeed I need to improve. That was the most important thing. And so that was the thing. Get better, overcome weaknesses. And I would say that's the first step of winning. Making changes. If you're not making changes in practice, you're not winning. And so there's a point where as we teach our kids to self-regulate, they're coming going, Jim, I'm not getting better. Well, we got to help them. We got to figure out why. And sometimes it's about all these little things that they got to do and this extra film or whatever. And I loved it when they started to get a return on that stuff. Number 2, I think Rhonda, you got to understand that volleyball is hard. It's a hard sport, technically, mentally. And so the game causes problems. You got to learn how to solve these problems. And then you're going to play UCLA, SC, Stanford, and they're going to cause more problems to try to prevent you from doing well. So problems are okay. We got to learn how to get better in practice and solve these problems. So practices that are hard, mentally, emotionally, physically, and you're learning how to solve these things, and there's a level of frustration, but we're not overboiling. That's a good thing, because most people look at problems as, I got all these problems and oh, woe me, and I can't get to where I want to go because of the problem. Well, that doesn't work in sports. You got to solve these problems and man up and get good and hit this shot when your shot is needed, and that's toughness. Mm-hmm. Or hit your serve. And then the last thing is, in any other industry, if you just do well, you do your job well, you're okay, but not in sports. You got to make one more play than the opponent. You can play well and get your butt kicked. And so you got to know it's about making plays. And so I would talk to the girls and guys about, that's a play at someday we got to make. That play, I've been around volleyball a long time, that's a play we got to make, and that's makeable because I've seen other people make it. And we just have to have that expectation or that standard. And so, and then I would tell them one play, this is not human nature, but one play could define the match. I remember matches where that happened in my life. And so we got to play one play like it's got the life of its own. Well, how hard is that? That's really difficult. But you got to do it because that's what's required at the highest end. So, David, Rhonda, that's
awesome.
A key question.
Lee Carter, the women's coach from Brandon University. How do you evaluate your standards, whether athletes are meeting them or not?
Gosh, dang it. Another question. There's trends like anything. And you got to keep track of the trends. You have to know everything, Ryan and David, but there's too many everything. So you got to know what is really important, what correlates to winning. And sometimes we don't. And we've got to know in order to give our kids the right opportunities. But I paid attention all the time. But again, it went back to, if we got to side out at between 67 and 71% to get to the Final Four, and we were siding out at 62 to 65. Well, that's where we're at. That's where we're at. And it's not this magic thing that we're going to get to say. We got to work on the right things. And there's lots of stuff. And you got to make some choices and decisions that allow you to learn the habits that you need to develop so you can meet those standards on game day. And so I don't know if that's a good question or a good answer, Ryan, but it's a great question. So I don't know, but being in a long time, I generally knew what we had to pass and what we had to hit at and what we had to side out at and what our setters had to locate at and make the right choices and all those things. We had to create opportunities and what was our conversion rate and what were all those things. Yeah.
Awesome. Another question from Lee, on kind of jumping back to recruiting. On recruit visits, does the team give input on what they thought of that recruit?
Yeah, but I didn't say we're going to recruit him because Cindy and Kathy did. But yeah, I wanted to know what they thought, and then I would ask them, did you guys tell them the truth and ask the real questions and do all that? And, yeah. Or if the kid said, hey, I want to go out and just, hey, where's the party? Well, let's go party. Or, well, yeah, there's a time and a place for that. But, if they're on their visit trying to figure out if this coaching staff can help them become what they want to become, they're not thinking about those things. And so, yeah, I wanted to know that. And there were times I pulled the plug. I don't care how good you are. I wanted kids that wanted to win at a high level, wanted to be All-Americans. I wanted kids that wanted to be Olympians. But more so, I wanted kids that wanted to invest and learn how to do it, become a champion. You know, and you don't know that in high school. That's why you go to a program to learn how to work hard, how to focus hard, how to stay involved in a drill mentally, how to develop tolerance emotionally, mentally, physically, which is, I think that's what separates people, you know, and for sure that they didn't think they had arrived, because what got you that far isn't going to get you any further. And so if you want to get to the final, you got to develop and, again, meet these standards, but you do that by developing your game. So, yeah, we listened to the parents to see what kind of upbringing. I listened to, I tried to get to know that kid.
Fair enough. Jeff Anderson, do you use athlete communication / feedback tools to sharpen your practice performance? Example, RPE, rate of perceived exertion.
Yeah, I did. I was going to try whatever. I had those exercise physiologists come to me and say, try it. I just never understood. You know, we're teaching kids how to work hard, and I just know what the mind can limit you. And so there were lots of kids, my own daughters. Molly was a soccer player. I love you more than anything in the world, but you work hard relative to your third grade class. You got to learn how to work hard, and your body can handle it. The way God made the body is amazing, but the mind is weak. Push your limits. Well, that's hard. Well, that's why NFL and NBA guys get coaches to push them and make them do things they don't want to do. So, I tried some of that stuff, but you know what? I've been in the gym. I've seen people work hard. I've seen energy levels. I've seen intensity levels. The best gym I was ever in, was I got to be in a bald shagger guy in 1987 in the greatest volleyball team to ever play. Karch Karai, Steve Timmons, Jeff Stork. That, the intensity was unmatched. And I just remember getting goosebumps going, I want to create these conditions. And of course, Marv created the conditions, but also Karch, and it was Craig Buck. I mean, they were the greatest team to ever play. And I just thought, that's the picture I want to paint and I want people to see. Now, it's not for everybody. Trust me. I had told my own daughters, don't do it because dad did it and don't do it because mom did it. This is your deal. And you know what? It's so freaking hard that you don't have to do it if you don't want to do it, and that's okay. I will still love you more than any kid in the world. But if you choose to do it, well, you better work your ass off. And you better go harder than you've ever, and you better test yourself and go for that big return. And, that's all my dad ever said. If you do it, Jim, you better do it the best you can. And my mom said the same thing. And then they had that example, because they worked harder than anybody, and they worked smarter. So here I am. I'm way off your question.
It's awesome. I got one final question. I know there's, Ryan and I have these discussions quite often, and I know there's a billion books out there. Are there any books that you would recommend for the coaches listening in, seeing that we're stuck at home during this COVID time?
Okay, David, you're on it. I want to tell you one quick story.
Okay.
The Training Soccer Champions was out there, and I had coaches call me and go, Jim, you got to read this book. Well, I married a soccer player from Notre Dame, my wife, and she played against North Carolina. And then all of a sudden she coached at Notre Dame, and they beat North Carolina on North Carolina's home field. And I got to know Chris Petroselli, who was the head coach, and he was big-time person, great man. My wife loved him. She learned so much from him, and he was one of the greatest coaches. And we used to have lunch occasionally. Well, one day he brought me a book, and he said, I'm going to go. We got to play. Read this book, and let's go to lunch and talk about it. It was Training Soccer Champions, and I loved it. It is so meaningful by Anson Dorrance. And I took this book, and I would exchange books with Carl every 6 months. We would exchange books, and he read it, and then he got back to me and said, read it again, and he said it influenced his whole life. So that was a little story, but then that's how Anson has influenced volleyball, because he went through Carl. Carl created the cauldron and all that stuff. So then The Score Takes Care of Itself by Bill Walsh. That is, I loved it. The stories, it hit me, and I could really relate to it. I really liked The Servant Leader by Ken Blanchard. There were things in there, he talks about character, he talks about competence, which are all the things that you got to do as a leader, because we know there's some overlapping principles, but leadership is specific. And so, but it's hard to define, but when you see it, you know it, all that. I read all the From Good to Great by James Collins, I think it was, and all those books that came out, The Talent Code, I remember reading that. And then there's one that you got to read. It's kind of unique, that it's called The Education of a Coach by Belichick. And then what you learn in there is the process of a coach and how to become a coach and acquire these teaching skills. But also, you don't have to be an all NFL player to become a great coach, because his whole staff, I don't even think, played in the NFL. And they were great teachers, and they could apply stuff. They just didn't know stuff. They could apply it. And so I learned all that stuff.
Awesome. Well, I just want to thank you for your time, and I could spend probably another 3 or 4 hours talking with you on here, but yeah, I said it was going to be an hour, so I appreciate you taking the time to be with us. I'm sure I will be picking your mind through emails and whatnot in the future. But Ryan, if you have anything you want to add at the end? Ryan is good. So, sorry, go ahead, Ryan.
I'm good. I just want to thank you, Jim, for just kind of sharing with us what you've learned over the history. There's just a wealth of knowledge there that I hope people can appreciate and love.
Well, I appreciate you guys, and you David, you do it. I listen to your stuff, and I really like it, and I've learned a lot. And if I can ever help or be on again, please call me.
Awesome, Jim. Well, we hope to see you back on the bench. You talked about it briefly here in one of the questions, so that you were debating it. So maybe we'll see you out of retirement.
I'm taking off to go to Finland. So once I get my vaccination, but yeah, I miss coaching. It's killing me, but I'm also open to other stuff too. So if you need me for anything, let me know.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Jim. And we'll be back next Saturday for another Coach the Coaches.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate you.